Good morning, American Literature 2130 Tennessee Tech Fall 2020 semester, Mr. Smith's class. We've gotten to know each other pretty well, considering that we're all on a Google meeting and not in a classroom. And with the COVID surging all over our state and our country, I'm okay with that. So, and those of you who have been sick, I hope you're healed up. If you've had family members that have been sick, I hope you've healed up. So far, my spouse, Jeannie, who also works at Tech, and I are both healthy, so that's a good thing. So women and the Beat generation. So I don't know why I decided to start with iced coffee, but here's some iced coffee. Can you all see some coffee, some glasses with some coffee ice cubes? I'd been a fan of iced coffee for a really, really, really long time before I read in Diane DiPrima section of the Beat Reader about how to make iced coffee with coffee ice cubes. And there's a lot of food in this little memoir segment, which in your textbook is on page 459 from the book called Dinners and Nightmares. And it says, "What I ate where?" On 461, it says, "I remember iced coffee made from powdered skim milk and coffee ice cubes and a sprinkle of cinnamon. And this was very good indeed. It was a very hot night, summer and August, in the same apartment where I later had my first meal in New York. And we were then still in high school or just graduating. It was a veritable gathering of maidens, enough to make your mouth water, enough even to make my mouth water in retrospect." And she goes on and she talks about being a girl in the summer, a young woman in the summertime in New York with other young women and having a great time and drinking iced coffee. The end of the paragraph, it says, "Endless supplies of this drink, and it seems to me, I may be wrong, but it seems to me we were happy." So to be young and happy and drinking iced coffee in New York City as a teenage beatnik, that is Diane DiPrima. So I just decided to begin with the iced coffee. We were on a family trip. I cannot remember where. I was an adult, maybe in my late 20s, and I was traveling maybe in my early 30s, and I was traveling with my parents. So I was around 30, I guess, early 30s, and we were in a bookstore. And if you've got a book problem like I do, you love to get lost in the bookstore. So we got lost in the bookstore, and I found this book, The Portable Beat Reader. Somehow, having already been to Naropa and read Howell and studied with Ginsberg, I still had never seen this book, The Portable Beat Reader, and I was immediately fell in love with this textbook. And I believe it was in that bookstore on that family trip that I read about iced coffee for the first time, iced coffee ice cubes via Diane DiPrima for the first time. And then I picked up this very copy of the Beat Reader that I'm holding in my hands that is super soiled and loved and dog-eared. So it's about a 20-year-old copy of our textbook that I picked up then. And if not very many of you came on Friday, but I'll make available the video. But our guest, Michael, read from Burroughs, William Burroughs, and immediately I was uncomfortable. Burroughs makes me super uncomfortable, and I'm not like I respect his role in the movement and his kind of a legacy as an American figure of the counterculture, but Burroughs makes me super uncomfortable. Maybe it was the fact that he was a heroin junkie his whole life, but it might also be the fact, and that I think in a way where Kerouac's alcoholism looked really bad on him toward the end of his life, Burroughs is like kind of like Keith Richards, you know, he made bad seem okay. And but one of the strangest stories about William Burroughs is they were playing this strange game in Mexico, and he accidentally murdered his wife and didn't really care for her. And I just want to just, especially today, say that just because we study these guys and we're interested in them doesn't mean that we approve of everything that they did. By any stretch of the imagination. So my big three are Ginsberg, Kerouac, and DiPrima. So I've dethroned William Burroughs as kind of the king of the, well, actually Kerouac is the one they called the king of the beats, but I've dethroned Burroughs in his Trinity role as one of the top three beats, and I've displaced him with Diane DiPrima. And Anne Waldman is kind of a younger sister of DiPrima. Will figure prominently in our discussion of the women beats today and on Friday. And please come back on Friday. It's a short week this week. And also we will be talking about chant poems, how to write a chant poem. And we'll be looking at some of the sample chant poems that have been made famous by Anne Waldman and Diane DiPrima, which is a particular style of beat poetry that I love and that I've modeled a lot of my writing after. I've written several poems using some of these techniques that I learned from Anne back in the day, back in probably 91, when I was there just by studying her. But it was something I really internalized around the early 90s, and I've just kept it in my poetry toolbox ever since. And it's a really fun and easy way for us to get interested and excited about writing our own poems, which of course you all will be doing for your midterm on the end of the month. So this is Anne and her son. I can't say his name. Is it Ansem? Anyway, Anne's cool son who plays music with her, and why I cannot say his name. And Anne and her scarves. Anne is known for her scarves, the woman of many scarves. But she's a New York poet, younger beat, who partnered with Alan to start the Jack Kerouac School at Naropa. And this is 10 years ago. And that's me in the middle there, visiting with them as it was, and I've got a scarf too. Hey, it was winter time. But Anne's only visit to Cookville. But that's when I met Michael, who was our guest on Friday. And I've got a recording of her Fast Speaking Woman that I'll share with you all between now and Friday that was recorded at the Backdoor Playhouse here on campus. So it's important to understand the importance of women in the beat movement. And there's a great picture taken probably in the 80s or 90s at Naropa of Anne and Diane, maybe even in the 70s, who knows. Diane is still with us, but my understanding is she's not in good health. She would be in her, thank you. I like fedoras as well. Thank you very much. Got a great comment there. So now I've lost my train here. Let's see. So, oh, Diane is still with us. So many of the great beats are still with us. I mean, Gary Snyder's still with us. Ferlinghetti, I think I told you all, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, the guy who published Ginsberg for the first time, the proprietor of City Lights. I think he's 101. Ferlinghetti's either 101 or 102. Now, many of them have all gone on, you know, to beatnik heaven or hell or some combination thereof, or nirvana, whatever. We'll talk about religion and the beats on next Monday, so we'll get into some interesting conversations, I'm sure, after that next Wednesday. But Diane is not of good health. I think she would be about 86 years old right now. Got many kids, and we'll talk about one of her lovers in just a minute, the poet Leroy Jones, later known as Amiri Baraka. But I want to just share what is the typical understanding of great women that emerged in the 50s and 60s. And while the hippie movement and the beat movement were considered to be avant-garde, literary and progressive and, quote, liberal, it wasn't until the 70s that the women's movement started. And the women's movement started as a reaction to the peace movement and the civil rights movement and all of these countercultures, because in those countercultures, women were still seen in a subordinate role. And I'm just going to read a short excerpt from A History of the Beat Generation, written by Bill Morgan, called The Typewriter is Holy, that really typifies this problem. He says we should think of the Beat Generation as a social circle instead of as a literary movement. So he calls the beat movement really not a movement, but just a group of friends. And he does this almost to let them off the hook. He says, which will explain why so few women writers identified with it, with DiPrima being the chief early exception. People are products of their times. This is, again, Bill Morgan writing here. And the friends of the beats were no exception. They grew up in an era where men were called to do important things and women were expected to support them in those endeavors. Many of the beats saw women as sex objects, providers, and mothers, and rarely did they believe that they could write as well as their male counterparts. They failed to examine their own prejudices and missed opportunities to discover some remarkable talent. Even though these men were avant-garde in many respects, the role of women was severely limited in their eyes. Even if some of the women they knew were also writers, they did not realize that their work might be as notable as the efforts of the men. The simple truth is that they had few female friends and were surrounded almost exclusively by males. there's a myth that that gay men are sexist, and I've heard that over the years. And some gay men probably are. They don't like women. I mean, they're not affectionate towards women. But in particular with Burroughs and Ginsberg, there seems to be a disrespect of women. And then Kerouac, I think, loves women profoundly. I mean, he certainly has sex with a lot of them, but he doesn't seem to understand the equality and the respect that normally would be afforded to women. And Morgan continues, it was a strong women who were extremely self-confident and self-assured, like Diane DiPrima, who could break out of the little woman mold that Allen and the others had put them into. It took years for many of the men of the Beat generation to realize that the world was changing. Only then did they recognize that some of the women they had known were marvelous writers. 30 years later, the Beat canon was expanded to include them, but it remains to this day a small subset within the larger circle. So today, I would say, and this is based on my time at Naropa and working in the discipline of poetry, that this has been toppled. And some of the great figures, at least in counterculture poetry, are women. And there's a long list of great women poets that we're not looking at in this class: Audre Lorde, Adrienne Rich, Anne Sexton. I mean, it just goes on, and then going all the way back to, like, say, Emily Dickinson. So there's great women American poets. I don't want anybody to think that there's not, and that there not have always been. But the boys club, the good old boys club of the Beat movement, was challenged by Diane DiPrima in incredible ways. And she challenges ideas about what it means to be counterculture, what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a feminist. She challenges it in so many incredible ways, which we will see here just a little bit this morning. And hopefully you all will do some reading on your own. I'm very proud to say that years ago, this unit inspired somebody to become a Beat writer herself, and even a scholar of the Beat women, a female student of this class from several years ago, is actually doing academic research, writing about Diane DiPrima kind of as a full-time thing. So she's our main go-to. The pages that she's in your Beat reader should be on your syllabus, but that section, that memoir section I read, is from Dinners and Nightmares. What I Ate Where starts on page 459. And then the main section of her poetry that we'll be looking at starts on page 359, which explains that she was the granddaughter of Italian immigrants and dropped out of college to become a writer, and moved to New York City as a teenager to become part of the Beat scene. And we're going to hear in just a few minutes about some of the stuff that she was involved in the New York City counterculture. But a lot of our geography of the Beats so far in this class has been focused on a West Coast scene that focused around the North Beach neighborhood in San Francisco, which is near Chinatown, and later, in the 60s became part of the Haight-Ashbury district, expanded to include places in California like the Berkeley community, where the campus, University of California campus, was in the East Bay, and then of course down south from there, there's Big Sur. Up north, there's Stinson Beach and the Redwoods. And so the geography of the Northern California coast is so integrated into who the Beats are. And we'll be learning, in a little while about, the Grateful Dead in this class in a couple of weeks. And so the West Coast San Francisco scene is so important to what the counterculture is in America and to understanding this time in America. But there was a New York scene as well that focused on Greenwich Village and then later the East Village. And there's Anne Waldman came out of the New York School, and Ed Sanders was a major poet who we won't be talking about, but he was very much a part of the counterculture and very much a documentarian of that time. Ed Sanders is known also for writing a book about Charles Manson and many other great books. And Sanders is still with us. Ed Sanders is one of the great Beats that's still with us. But the New York scene kind of had its own flavor. And then, of course, DiPrima's lover of many lovers, she took many lovers, but Leroy Jones will figure prominently in the story of Diane DiPrima. But something that Diane and Leroy did was that they started their own zine, The Floating Bear. And for the mixtape assignment at the end of the semester, and even for the poetry assignment. In the past, I've had a really emphasis on making your own fanzine type format, which is basically a self-published photocopied little booklet that I've made dozens of since I was in high school. I'm a huge part of the small press, the alternative press, the DIY press. But, you know, people maybe know DIY from like home improvement TV shows that they maybe watched growing up with their parents. But DIY simply means do it yourself. And the Beat movement was very instrumental in DIY culture. It later became, you know, part of, you know, punk rock. It's definitely part of hippie stuff. But today it's like, you know, the revival of learning stuff from your grandma, you know, learning how to knit, learning how to sew, make your own clothes, learning how to can food, grow your own food, make your own tools, blacksmithing, or some of the stuff you could do, learn over at the Crafts Center down in Smithville, the Appalachian Center for the Crafts, which is part of Tennessee Tech, making paper. But anyway, you know, being your own publisher was a big part of what the Beats were. And it's a part of that culture that is so near and dear to my heart, because most of my publishing history I've done myself, DIY. Not to say that I couldn't get published if I wanted to. I just sort of have not liked having to deal with editors. I'm very idiosyncratic and maybe even a little bit insecure. So I've just been my own publisher most of my life. And so I learned a lot of this from the Beat movement. It was one of the things I studied when I studied at Europa. I took a whole class in self-publishing. It's just been my jam for really 35 years at least. So Floating Bear was this zine that Diane DiPrima and Leroy Jones did together. These are great. I mean, they're primitive looking. They, you know, were mailed in the mail. They were made on a typewriter, and then they were copied, you know, on mimeograph machines coming before photocopiers, Xerox machines. Back in our day, we would go to a Kinko's or a copy store and, you know, stay up all night making copies, or we would find somebody who had a copier that they would let us use, or maybe you could go to somebody's workplace and they would let you use the photocopier at work. And so an issue of this mimeographed Floating Bear newsletter now would cost a lot of money. Collectors have really taken to the Beat movement. We talked about the scroll, the Kerouac scroll going, and a lot of these papers and publications have ended up in library collections, archives, literary archives as well. But very important stuff here is going on in New York City in the counterculture. You know, Ed Sanders, who I just mentioned, he had his fanzine. It was called Blank, Bad Word, a Journal of the Arts. But so I was starting to say for your assignment in the regular semester, I would have everybody make a fanzine and they would bring their fanzines to class. We're not going to be able to do that. So I'm going to kind of lean off on the fanzine format, though. You can make content analogous to a fanzine and just post it on your blog or send it to me in an email. But basically what we're adding is an artistic element to just the words as well. And I'll show you some more examples later of stuff I've done. But basically, usually all I do is take an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, you know, and fold it over. Oh, heck, I'm just thinking about it now so I don't forget. So this is a fanzine that a friend and I make called Ordinary Space. This is a current fanzine that we're working on now. And basically, it's 8.5 by 11 pieces of paper folded over, stapled at the middle. And we got these printed up. We made a couple hundred of these, a small run. But we got these printed up at Staples in town here. And then we give them away to our friends as presents. So anyway, that was one aspect of how involved she was. And so notice, I don't know if you can see it on your screen, but the slide says that Diane DiPrima and Leroy Jones were the editors of this. So yes, I don't know why I put the title page to my slideshow in the middle of the slideshow. But Diane DiPrima was a revolutionary Beat woman, and it is October 2020, and you are here in Topics in American Lit. It's kind of like I was rolling the credits in the movie, and then the movie started, you know, kind of in the middle, but here we go. Anyway, so Dinners and Nightmares is a great story. that talks about iced coffee. It talks about this weird pudding that they made. It was basically tomato sauce and potatoes. It sounds really gross, actually, and that's what the story opens up with. But for some reason, and I'm literally am obsessed with Oreos because of this. This is maybe the best part of the semester. Okay, so you all just, it's going to be over before you know it, but get ready. This is sometimes everybody's, favorite part of the whole semester. If I can find it, I had the page marked and now I've seemed to have lost my spot here. So after the pudding, oh yes, on the bottom of 461, right after the section about iced coffee, and I'll just read it to you from our textbook, Diane DiPrima, page 461. I remember the winter of the January. I ate nothing but Oreos. If you know what Oreos are, they're those. See, now if we were in the classroom, I would have brought today to class like mountains of Oreos, and I would be passing them out in the classroom. And I do miss the classroom for days like when I can bring you all cookies. And I apologize that I can't send, FedEx, have some FedEx Oreos delivered to your door right now. I remember the winter, the January, I ate nothing but Oreos. If you know what Oreos are, they're those chocolate cookies, 2 of them at a time, stuck with sugar in the middle and very addictive. I mean, I really got hooked on them. There was this low armchair in my pad. Pad meant crib, household, apartment building, whatever. So there was this low armchair in my pad, and I would sit in it and eat Oreos and read and sometimes drink a little milk or water, because Oreos in large numbers, they tend to stick in your teeth. When I wanted company, I would go upstairs and visit these 2 girls who were my neighbors. They were a little crazy. They liked Oreos too, but not as much as I did. I mean, not 3 or 4 packages a day. But anyway, they would sit there and eat them with me and keep me company. And they washed theirs down with ale and Oreos, ale being beer here. I didn't dig too much together like that. But boy, to hear the wind blow and all that awful January rain and a bunch of windows looking out on old, crumbling, filthy brick walls, and to sit in the middle of all this, eating Oreos and reading was, well, anyway, it was a way to get through January. To get through January in Manhattan is hard. To get through January and February the same year, almost impossible. One of the best ways to get through it, I found, was this, of eating Oreos, except that it makes you fat. I mean, really fat, even if you don't eat anything else and you think, shh, bad word, how can I get fat? I haven't had breakfast or lunch or anything like that. But don't kid yourself. Oreos make you fat. Or maybe it's just me. The girls upstairs ate a lot of them, but I couldn't tell if they were getting fatter or skinnier because they never got out of bed. That was a weird pad. That was a weird pad. And to be young and living in New York City is, and just everything that they ate pretty much that winter or that time in New York City. So food and writing is a whole sub-discipline. I have a colleague here at Tech that wrote her dissertation on her PhD dissertation on food and writing. It's really a great field. But I'm obsessed with Oreos. I'm sure I will have one for lunch today. And I blame Diane DiPrima and that section of that book. But for whatever reason, I mean, that might be your blog. You might write your blog on Oreos or Diane DiPrima and food. So it doesn't get much wilder than this. They have one daughter who's a very active person. She's got a pretty active Twitter game on the West Coast. Dominique DiPrima, Baraka Jones. Laura Jones, later Mary Baraka, and Diane DiPrima were collaborators, and they were lovers. He was black, she was white. He was married to Hetty Jones, and this caused all kinds of problems, as you can imagine. But they were absolutely madly in love, and I'm going to share with you a little bit of the story that leads up to one of the major poems in this unit that students have over the years really appreciated talking about and writing about, much like they've liked talking about Oreos. And this is much less frivolous here. But if you've ever been in love with somebody who also had a partner, you know how complicated this is. And the 60s and the Beats and all this, there's a lot of rhetoric around free love, and beware. That rhetoric has been around forever, and it is, I mean, people believe it. I mean, there's whole, like, you know, TV shows you can watch on cable, on Showtime and HBO about, you know, the Mormon or the Latter-day Saints or the Mormons and the plural marriage. There was a whole TV show about a family where a man had multiple wives. There's been hippies and communes where this was participated in. But jealousy is a human emotion that is extremely real. And you run into complicated situations like the one that she's going to run into. So we don't have time to read this whole book, and I've not assigned it. But if you go down the Diane DiPrima rabbit hole, which I would, of course, think would be amazing if you did, it's called Recollections of My Life as a Woman, Diane DiPrima, The New York Years. And so she talks about Leroy Jones. She talks about listening to Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit, and this brings us back to our blues and gospel unit, but definitely being in the early 60s and being a white woman having an affair with a black man who's also married definitely caused some issues for her. At that time, I was only half aware that the songs carried the bitterness of the dilemma of our interracial love, as well as the outsiderness of our social situation. Roy was, after all, a married man. I accepted the otherness of our blackness, whiteness without question, amidst the scowls of my neighbors when we kissed in the doorway of my apartment, the blind bigotry of my block on the Lower East Side, of all the surrounding blocks, seas of Indo-European ethnicity that washed against the oases where I and my friends lived, worked, drank coffee, danced together, made love, learned or sought to learn each other's hearts. Knew only there was no world where it was simply okay. Not for our black and whiteness, not for me, a single woman with the child. So she talks about their love of poetry. This is a really long section. I won't be able to read it all, but I'm going to read several passages of this. So they ended up having a child together, but this was years later. She said, years later, some months after Dominique's birth, we stood naked in the light of that front room in another apartment on the East 4th Street, in the light of the day, in the piercing heartbreak of Willow, moved each of our bodies slowly. And she talks about how beautiful it was to be with him. But of course, they did not stay together. And she, again, listening to blues music together. Oh, and this is also how their love relationship worked out. When you're having an affair, you can't really set up the times correctly for when you get together. So this is what she says about her paramour. She says, he would come late and often come stoned, sometimes just make it to my house and fall asleep in his clothes across me in the bed. He would come angry and intense from some encounter, some confrontation with the strange white world. He would come for the evening with time enough for food, wine, talk before lovemaking, or he would arrive at 3 a.m. and leave at 4. But what was perfect and inviolable about those first months was the feeling, a depth of feeling you can't fake. So she was just madly in love. She was just madly in love to this person, but she made sacrifices of herself, and you'll see here how many sacrifices of herself she made. First of all, she had to always be ready, you know, and she could never dictate when it was going to happen. It always happened on his terms, and I believe it's 5 children, and she would, you know, have to make sure the kid was asleep. I would drop what I am doing, drop even the poem for either of them, as I drop all else for the poem. And so she says this, that she would give up anything to write poetry except for her child and her lover. Make love, make coffee, make a painting with my daughter. So that's what life is. Life is, you know, make love, make coffee, make poetry. To be available, a woman's art I saw as a discipline, a spiritual path. To be available, but to stay on course somehow, self-defined in the midst of it, all my work, all my life. And so this is her ethos, is that she would be romantically available to him whenever he wanted her. And that to her, she considered that to be a spiritual discipline. As you can imagine, that all kinds of problems can arise from this kind of an ethos. And then she believes that life is art. And this is something that I try to stress every time I teach the Beats, and I'm not sure I've stressed it amongst this group as much as I could have, but life is art and art is life. There's no place where the poem ends or the novel ends and life begins. The two are one, and one is part of the other. And she writes about this. She says, and she uses all caps in her memoir. She says, the requirement of our life is the form of our art. The requirement of our life is the form of our art. Art is magic. The requirement of our life is the form of our art. Art is magic. And she continues to see him, even though, she says, he slept around, he lied, he came over drunk or stoned and fell asleep on the bed. He didn't show up when he said he was going to. Showed up unexpectedly, treated me like a peer, a queen, a servant. A less than human, don't have to explain to her kind of being. Or sought a confidant, a place to weep. To put all the burdens down and with them the roles. All that went without saying. I took it as it came, as it was dealt. The access of feeling that flooded me left no room for hesitation or doubt. And so she was so crazy about this person that she would put up with stuff. And then she says simply, and you know, birth control still is not as common as it was today. And, you know, for many people, it's a rite of passage, you know, when you're a teenager or a young adult to decide, you know, if you're going to have sex or not have sex. Are you going to use birth control? Not use birth control. She says that they did not. And she was doing it on purpose. She said, this was the high drama I was playing out, what it meant to move toward love. So you're having an affair with a married man that's only on his terms, and you're not using birth control. Guess what happens? And since she sees this as religious, I mean, this is her calling to be his partner, even though it's not clear from anything I've looked at or that I know about that that his wife was okay with this. And then she gets pregnant. She believes that this is what she wants. She says, all I knew was that I felt the child had a right to come through me, to be and dance in the world. Difficult as that might make it for everyone, I had no moral imperatives as such about an abortion. Illegal and dangerous as it was our right. But I saw myself as a channel through which souls fell to birth and became my guests, my darlings, for a tiny slice of time. So she wants to have this child. He wants her to terminate the pregnancy, keeping in mind that they later did have one child together. And she's begging him to change his mind. They're cuddling. And then she goes into great detail. And this is articulated in a poem in your textbook. So this, on page 359 in your textbook, on the bottom of the page, it says, DiPrima, the mother of 5 children, has said she is dismayed that her eloquent meditation on her abortion, originally published as a broadside, has been read by anti-abortion groups as supporting their cause. And then on page 363 is the poem, Brass Furnace Going Out, Song After an Abortion. And I encourage you all to read that on your own. It is a very powerful meditation on that experience. Now, of course, you know that abortion in the early 70s was made legal by a landmark Supreme Court decision, but it's still very difficult to do. It's very hard to do in certain parts of the country, harder than in others. And we live in a place where it's probably much harder to do than in other parts of the country. And you might have to drive to another city. There's definitely issues that come along with it. And she says, even that she's having this conversation with her partner, and she's a young woman at the time. So she's born in 34. This is the early 60s. She's in her mid to late 20s. She even confesses that she wants to be cool in his eyes. And she even calls it herself a chick. And, you know, I mean, that's just the 60s, right? So here she is. She's trying to figure out how to be a cool chick, even though she's basically bawling her eyes out because she couldn't come to terms with this decision. She writes, abortions in those days were held simply to be women's business, something you don't talk about, didn't lay on anyone else, especially not the men. One of the unsung, unspoken ways women risk their lives without making too much of it. Maybe you never used protection for any number of reasons. Maybe you did, and like me, you didn't bother on that particular occasion, particular night, because you wanted to make a gesture, didn't want to interrupt a delicate situation where emotions ran high, didn't want to seem to be thinking of yourself at such an important moment. For me, I'd always gone to bed with any lover knowing I could become pregnant, knowing I could die over the encounter. However casual the immediate feeling, I had often looked at that squarely. I felt it was the only way that one could look at love, could see it clearly as it was, life and death matter. And so I'd made it a rule not to make love if I wouldn't have wanted the baby, not to do it if I wasn't willing to die. Every time you make love, you risk your life, or risk changing the rest of your life. And here it was. Now it gets really complicated. She writes, since Roy did not want the child, I felt that if I loved him, it was incumbent on me to have the abortion no matter what I was feeling, to show the extent of my love by doing what I felt was wrong, to commit for me what was tantamount to a crime simply because the man I loved willed it so. And I would take the blame, the consequences, the blood on my hands, and not say anything about it. It was, after all, the code that I had learned, the code of Italian women, to do what he wanted and to take the consequences. And so at this time, there's an underground network. You have to have connections in the underground network. You have to be able to figure out how to make these connections work. And she does. It was late afternoon, and I arrived at the designated town, and I walked down the street from the bus station to the small brick house. I was lucky to be where I was. The man I was going to was a doctor, a real MD, it was said, who did the work he did out of the conviction that it was needed. And then she goes through and describes in prose what she describes in the poem, the actual procedure and how hard it was for her, and then just being upset and crying and trying to make it back home. And I, of course, was alone. It simply hadn't occurred to me to ask anyone to come here or to be here when I got back. I had sent Jean away a couple of days and had told no one about what was happening. Freddie knew, but he wasn't around, maybe working summer stock or something. It was the beginning of summer. Roy had not offered to come around, and I had not mentioned anything. Pain in my heart, far worse than the cramps. So she's experiencing physical pain and emotional pain. Pain in my heart, far worse than the cramps. I was writing persistently, writing to the child that I had killed, had sent away. I filled page after page in some kind of wobbly scrawl, written mostly lying down, some kind of ritual goodbye. And so she writes a love poem to the baby, and that's the poem that is in your textbook. And you know, this is top 10 topics never to talk about in college, right? You know, there's my official training of a Master of Arts in Literature and a Master of Theology, but never in all of my training was there anything like the training you get sort of, you know, as a grad student in the faculty lounge. And there was just that kind of unspoken agreement that, especially in an English Comp 1 class, which is the predecessor to this course, the freshman writing course, you know, never let them write a paper about the death penalty, never let them write a paper about abortion. And I think that the concern here, or death or homosexuality or whatever, I think the concern here with these topics is that people aren't mature enough to have conversations with people with whom they disagree. They're too emotional, they're too dogmatic. But I feel like, you know, more than any other class that you've taken here at Tech, more than maybe even more than amongst your close group of friends, maybe even more than at church or whatever, the college literature curriculum is a safe place to talk about unsafe topics as grown-ups, and to train ourselves as adults to be willing to have these difficult conversations and to read difficult writing. And the Beats have been anything if not difficult writing for you all. I'm sure more difficult than the stuff that precedes it. And even after these books, we're going to read some interesting texts, but I don't think anything we'll read after this will be as hard as the Beat writers. But for a woman to step into this conversation, to insist that she be allowed to have the same sexual freedom as the men, and then to, you know, and to deal with the consequences. And so the poem that you're going to read that's affiliated with this conversation that I read to you from her memoir, Breast Furnace Going Out, is not a manifesto for the pro-choice movement. The pro-choice movement generally doesn't speak too much about the fact that it's a baby. We prefer in the pro-choice movement to not use that language. The pro-life movement, they prefer to use different language, and they definitely don't want to celebrate the kind of feminist sexual freedom and autonomy that Diane DiPrima is an icon for. So she doesn't fit in either box. She breaks the mold, and as a feminist, that's her autonomy and her freedom and her self definition. She's defining herself as a woman, as being in neither of these camps really through this poem, though she believes in the what later became the constitution, you know, the legal protected right of choice. She doesn't write this poem in the typical rhetoric that either side would be comfortable with, and I think that allows us to have a true understanding that within social movements that define the 60s, you're going to have a diversity of voices and a diversity of opinions, and she's a very powerful voice as a woman. And as a poet, she was often poor. And so I thought I had a slide. I don't have a slide. I should have a slide for her book, Memoirs of a Beatnik, one of the most famous books that she wrote in the late 60s. That's the picture from it there. She identifies herself as kind of a wild woman, and she writes, I think, because she was being paid, about basically the sex life of a Beat Generation woman in the 60s. And it's a very, very powerful text. Probably her most powerful text, and from this, the chant style that we will be looking at a little bit on Friday comes out of this, is the text Revolutionary Letters. This was the first book of hers that I owned, and it was a late 60s kind of manifesto of being in the counterculture in San Francisco. And every poem in the book is either about the hippie scene, it is about the spirituality of multiple religious traditions that we'll be talking about a little bit on this coming Monday. It was about the protest movement and the sense that the world was going to change because of the protest movement in more radical ways than it ended up doing. It was truly a manifesto. And the chant poems are just a little preview to Friday, but I'll share one of them with you on Friday, or parts of it is called Life Chant, which is that this idea of a repetition of a line almost is like a call and response. But I'll read this this first one, Revolutionary Letter number 1 after Bob Dylan. I have just realized that the stakes are myself. I have no other ransom money, nothing to break or barter but my life, my spirit measured out in bits, spread over the roulette table. I recoup what I can. Nothing else to shove under the nose of the maitre de jeu. Nothing to thrust out the window. No white flag. This flesh, all I have to offer to make the play with this immediate head. What it comes with, my move as we slither over this go board, stepping always, we hope, between the lines. I'll read this next one here, number 4. Left to themselves, people grow their hair. Left to themselves, they take off their shoes. Left to themselves, they make love, sleep easily, share blankets, dope, and children are not lazy or afraid. They plant seeds, they smile, they speak to one another. The word coming into its own, touch of love on the brain, the ear. We return with the sea, the tides. We grow, we return as often as leaves, as numerous as grass, gentle, insistent. We remember the way. Our babes toddle barefoot through the cities of the universe. So to be a free human being, I think for a lot of this movement was to recognize that even as we have a intellectual nature, a God nature, if you will, a spiritual, scientific nature, a civilized nature, that human beings are also embodied entities, that we're fully in our bare feet, basically. I think barefootness is like a really good image for this time, that we can touch the ground and that we she uses the metaphor in that second poem I read of the tides coming in and out, that we're a part of creation and not separate from this. And this goes back to Joy Harjo and this connection to nature that the indigenous writers have, American indigenous writers. And as we lead forward in a couple of weeks to reading Cheryl Strayed and Chris McCandless, this human ideal to connect with the land, and as a particularly American ideal to be geographically rooted, is so profound. I feel so connected to Middle Tennessee because I've lived here for so long. And this weekend we went and drove all over, Appalachia for our fall break, through Kentucky and West Virginia and Virginia and East Tennessee. And the land of this region, of this particular Mid-South region, has always spoken to me as being very powerful place to be. And so I think for Diane DiPrima, she seems to have a particularly feminist take on spirituality. She later wrote a very long poem called The Loba, which is a meditation on women's spirituality. And one of the things that she also does in that poem is she rewrites some stories from mythology and, from the Bible, from a woman's perspective. So I hope you all have enjoyed our introduction to Diane DiPrima. I'm going to stop the recording, and I have a minute for a question or a comment before